Now that we've done his basic proportion modeling, it's time to do a little bit more editing in Max. We're going to start off by setting up a basic light rig for him. I'm just going to get him in position, and then going over the light tab, we're just going to use standard Max lights, no Brazil lights for right now. We're just going to draw out a couple, and then we're going to duplicate them. So the first thing is just getting this one in a basic position. Make sure that the targeted spot is on, and make sure the target is actually pointing at the character. And then by shift dragging, we can duplicate the light. We'll call this one rim, and we'll call this one the point. Well, this will be our main light actually, so it's going to be probably the brightest of all. And that one's just going to be our fill. So now that we've got this, we're going to adjust some of the options here by first turning on shadows. And we're just going to use shadow maps to keep our render times reasonable. We're going to do this for all of them. So under the shadow map parameters, we're setting the bias down so that the distance from where the light actually hits in the shadow cast is not too high. We want to keep the sample range about between 4 and probably 8. If you do too much, it's really going to blow out your shadows, and they're going to be kind of hard to see if you can see them at all. And then we want the size to be about 1024, so it's a nice and smooth. Now these will all be dependent on what your actual scene is, but for what we're doing here, this should be just fine. The higher those settings go, the longer the render times will be. So. And then by using the view, you can actually look through the light and make sure that you're really focused on your character and that the light is actually pointing the way you want it to. And then we can adjust the hotspot in a little bit more interactive method. We want to make sure that it's focusing on the character and also has a little bit of a fall off going on. So we'll do this for all the lights right now. We're just focusing mostly on the center of the character. If we were working on just the head, I might adjust these lights to be pointing just at his face. But since we're doing the overall character form right now, I want to kind of point it over here. And then we want to make sure that we actually have the camera selected by going right-clicking on the view and going to select light. So there we go. And now we're just going to build a quick camera. Just like we do the light, it's going to be a targeted camera. We'll adjust this so it's actually showing us our whole character. Gotta zoom out a little bit. We don't want to adjust it too much so it doesn't have too much of a fisheye look to it. But we'll actually adjust the settings on it as well. There we go. I like to keep it something that looks pretty natural, not too distorted, but a little orthographic in some way, so that you can kind of get an idea of what's going on with the character, but not too much perspective going on. Right around here is usually where I like it, right around the 40. We'll give it a render, make sure it looks okay. So there he is. He's a little blown out with light right now, but we can still adjust some settings. So we're going to do that right now by going into the intensity, turning our main light down to about 0.5, our fill to about 0.2, and our backlight, probably keep it pretty high because we want it to have a nice rim light on him. And I also like to shift the colors a little bit to a bluish color in the back. Don't want to go too crazy with this, but for the modeling it's okay. When you start doing texturing for testing, you don't want to have too much colored light because it'll actually affect how your textures display. So keeping it a nice kind of grayish colors overall is good when you're testing. Not the most dramatic effect, but it really does help. Now we're going to turn the skylight on as well. Put down to about 0.5, get a little bit of the blue away. Actually, we're going to end up using a gradient map in here. You could use anything. You could use image-based like HDRI map. You could use really anything that you wanted to cast light. A gradient works really well though for just a quick overall kind of environment light. As you can see, we're just kind of adjusting some of these colors here. Now what I want to do here is I want to add a little bit of a material to them. Right now we're just using default standard whatever material is applied. So I want to have something with a little bit of specular highlight to it. You can see how this looks now. We turn the lights down quite a bit, and the skylight isn't on very loud right now. And we're not sure. We put that gradient on. We're not sure exactly where it's being cast from. So First, we're going to drag it over and put it as an instance to make sure that whatever we do here is going to affect our skylight parameters as well. Then you want to rotate these. Oops, wrong one. There we go. We want to make sure that the top, because we're going to put this on a spherical, the top is kind of the brightest and the bottom is going to be the darkest. So right now we're actually a little bit backwards, but we'll adjust that in one sec. I want a little bit of color here too. So you can see we've got a nice little light going on right now, which kind of simulates a sky and a ground plane as well. And then I dragged it back over, even though we had it on instance, because I want to make sure that it's really applying that way. Sometimes, even though you drag something as an instance, it actually doesn't affect it that way. So, to make sure that what we just did, I just re-dragged it over as an instance. And then I just set the image sampling up to P3, which has a pretty good blurring look to it. So, okay, this is showing off the form of the character pretty well. Next thing I like to do is, by going under the helpers and adding a null, we can attach our entire light system to it so that we don't have to worry about rotating the character and all of his props when we want to see how he looks with different lighting conditions. We can actually just attach all the lights and camera information right to this null, and when we rotate the null, it'll rotate everything. So to do that, we grab all the cameras and light, and then we use the select and link option, and we just drag it right onto that null. You can see now when we rotate this, it's going to rotate all of our lights and camera, and because all of the points of focus on these things are pretty much in the center of the character, you can see that by rotating and looking through the camera, it kind of looks like the character is being rotated. We'll just kind of do a couple of quick test renders to see how it looks. There's him from the side. You can see that it's keeping that same shadow and rim exactly where it would be, and the character is moving through the light as opposed to with the light, which really wouldn't help us when we want to do a turnaround to see how he really is going to look. Alright. So we want to clean up some of the naming a little bit, but what we're going to do now is we're actually going to build the costume for this character. So the first thing I do is I go under the poly draw options under Poly Boost, and I go to Surface, and I pick the character. Then I freeze him just so I don't have to accidentally select him later on. Although we may actually make him transparent instead of just frozen, so we can actually see through him when we build this stuff. But for right now, just freezing him is fine. And now that we have him as a draw on a surface selection, we can use the build tool by clicking on empty obj down at the bottom of the poly draw, which will make just kind of an empty container for us to add geometry to. And then using the build tool, we'll be able to start building our surface. Actually, I'm going to start with the poly topo and show you some of the ways that it works and some of the ways that it kind of fails. For the most part, this is a great tool, but you just have to kind of know its limitations. So you can see here I'm going to build pretty much the entire topology right here to see exactly how this would look. This is just the main lines here. If you start a line and you hold shift, you'll be able to continue the line as you go. So if you break the line and then you realize you need to go a little bit further, you just hold shift and click toward the end of it. And what this tool does is it only builds things that you've actually turned into a complete square. So here you can see we've got a number of squares built. And you can see that some of these lines are shooting off into space. It's because I didn't draw them on top of the object, so they went onto the grid space just by default. But it doesn't matter because they're not actually being made into squares. Now you can see here, because we did so much editing on this, that the Poly Topo tool really didn't solve this very well. It actually didn't solve it at all what we expect. So here's really how I would use something like this. Very small little increments. Just like we did last time. But I'm only going to worry about his shoulder area at this point. Just a smaller section instead of trying to go that big. It seems to have a little bit of trouble figuring out exactly what's going on. So if we just go a little bit more, a little easier with it, it goes a lot quicker. You can see this is a lot more predictable right here. And then using the border tool, we can actually connect any open edges that it left by just holding Control and Shift. And then using the connect tool, I can actually draw on the rest of the topology. And I want to make sure that his collars and any kind of seams that should be on him are more a little bit more natural as how a actual beater would look. So that means that this whole collar needs to kind of flow around his neck as opposed to just going right down his chest. So what's nice about these tools is you can really quickly re-topologize something, as you can see right here, and build new objects on top of your character, and make sure it's going to connect completely. So here I'm just using the border tool and drawing along, and now I can see that I've got a little bit too many lines here. So the connecting is going to be a little weird, but I want to just keep that a little bit sharper anyway, because that's going to be basically where his sleeve would go, or the end of his shirt, really. And although some of these areas are getting a little oddly stretched, we're going to fix that really quick. So just using the connect tool and the move tool. Now you don't have to use the move tool unless you want to move whole faces, edges, or edge loops and edge rings, because every tool, by holding Control-Alt-Shift, you'll be able to move verts at that time. But if you need to move something like faces or a group of objects or an element, then you go into the move tool. As you can see here, I'm in the connect tool, but by holding Control-Alt-Shift, I'm able to move these verts one by one. And just holding Shift on an edge as you drag and draw, just like we've done a little earlier. And then I want to add a symmetry to this, because this whole jacket is or this whole piece of clothing is going to be all the way around his body, and I don't want to build it on both sides. So a few other things I want to add is the shell modifier. You can see that in the center of his chest is actually not connected. And then I'm going to override the inner material ID. The reason I do that is so that later on, when I'm ready to clean this model up, it's really quick for me to select that whole inside of his costume, which I don't need that geometry, especially on this inside of his shirt, because he has a body underneath it. So that's just extra geometry, nearly double what you really need. So these little things are quick ways for you to work on cleanup. The shell tool, using that override material ID feature for the edges or for the interior the interior faces, is a great way to go. I'm just going to change some of the colors around. I made them transparent so I could kind of quickly move stuff around. And I'm going to speed things up a little bit here, just to move things along a little nicer. So you can see here, we're trying to keep everything in quads if at all possible. And it really shouldn't be that hard to do. I wanted to bring that down. He's got kind of a low-lying beater that he's wearing, so it should show a lot of his neck and clavicle area. And some of these points might not be snapping onto his body, so now I'm just moving them around to make sure they're actually snapped on his body. So we're going to take a look at the concept again. You can see he's got a pretty low hang to that collar piece. It goes down to about there, about where his belly button would be. I want to make sure that's all going to snap together when the symmetry's on. Now, one thing with the border tool is sometimes when you draw with it, if you go too quick, it doesn't understand where it's drawing from. So you really got to kind of move your mouse around the two edges you want to take it from, and it'll figure it out pretty quick. So here we go. We've got a pretty quick waistline for this. Take a quick look at what we've done so far. Now just to move ahead a little bit, to make the pants, we could do the exact same thing where we actually draw along where we want the seams and we want everything to go. But because this model is fairly clean, we can actually just grab the faces directly from there. We can do the same with the boot area. So we're going to take a look very quickly at where his pants are, where they start and where they end. It's about halfway through his shin. And we're just going to grab that whole area. And once again, having a clean model for this kind of stuff is really important, because you can just see how much faster it is to build the pants this way. And we're just going to clone it by holding Shift and clicking once on the Move tool. Call it Pants. Got those selected now. And I'm going to copy the Turbo Smooth and Shell right off of that. Right off of the beater that we made earlier. And I think I'm going to take the Symmetry too and delete one half. Turn off the see-through so we can actually see this object that we're working on. And change a couple colors around. I think we have it in material view right now, so we're actually not able to see the colors unless we change the material colors. I'm going to delete one half of these because we're going to do some edits to make him a little bit baggier. He's got some pretty big, they almost like parachute pants. So by fixing the seam on the symmetry, we can make sure that it all snaps together nicely, and then make sure that the center line of the pants also go right into the middle and are completely straight. You can do that just by grabbing that whole edge loop, going into the scale mode, and then just moving it along on I believe on Y. Now I'm just going to add some edges and clean up this whole thing. And the loop tools, I mentioned this earlier, these are great. There's a couple options in here. There's set flow and then there's center. So if you've got an object and you really want to kind of keep it all clean, just grab those edges. Right here we're just going to remove a few of these edges we just don't need. And we have the couple options in here for remove loops. As I was saying, the loop tools, though, are really helpful for the set flow. Will actually keep your the way that your mesh would subdivide. It'll try and solve exactly where the new loop should go and how it should be flowing onto the body. And then the connect tool also will just connect all the way along. And if you have the auto loop, if you then click set flow, it'll actually kind of bulge it out a little bit so it keeps you a nice smooth shape. It's great for adding more topology to stuff. And the center button will make sure it centers your loop in between the two outlying loops. We're going to do the same thing that we did for the pants, by the way, right here with the shoe. So I know his shoe should go a little higher here. Alright, we're going to clone this object to booties. And we want to make this to be not see-through. And basically at this point we really want to make sure that we're looking at the concept, because Hong did some really nice stuff in here where the character's boots had some nice kind of flow to them. So we're just going to take a look at that really quick and then begin building off of this really simple shape. So here's the boots. You can see they have kind of a multi-part setup to them, and there's the side of them. They've kind of got a couple different outer shells, and then a nice piece on the soles, which we probably won't work too much on the soles. It's an area that you never really see unless you're specifically told to. It's kind of an area you don't need to worry too much about the detail on unless you think it's going to be shown. Just like any area, really, that if it's not going to be shown, it's a waste of time in production to build it. So I'm using this basic shell of the booty, and I'm going to use that as a surface to draw on with the poly tools. The poly draw tools. And first I'm going to build that outer shell. You can do this really quick. So basically we're just going to have this go along here. And by doing this we can make sure it's a really clean layout too, instead of just cutting right into the boot and trying to move stuff around, or building it and then hoping that it'll all fit together. Making it a little bit darker will make it easier to see too. And then you can either use a shell or a push modifier just to push it off a little bit. And I'm going to use the shell anyway because on this guy it looks like it's a different piece, kind of a flap that goes over. As you can see in the concept right there, it's almost a separate part of the shoe. Kind of a mud flap or something. I'm just going to adjust all this stuff. And once we've built about half of it, you realize this shoe isn't actually symmetrical. So we'd either have to rebuild the other half, or I have a little way of building the other half using the poly boost tools as well. So we're just going to clone it over to the object. Call it other side. It won't matter because we're going to connect this all together in a moment. Then we're just going to mirror this on X. You can see it doesn't quite line up, but that's alright. So we're just going to get it into place. Doesn't have to be perfect, just kind of roughed in to where it should be. Rotate it a little bit. Just kind of line it up, basically. You can see it doesn't quite work. It doesn't follow the flow of his actual calf and ankle area. But it's close. It's really close. So using the move tool and holding control, I'll actually be moving an entire face, and that whole face, all 4 verts, will snap onto the shoe. And I can do this really fast. And then move every point if there's a couple that don't seem to be snapping on. We'll speed it up a little bit here. And then drag this along so that it's all going to attach in the middle right there. Even if we have to draw another line of faces. And we're just going to split that edge so it's a little bit more... It's not quite so stretched. Trying to keep everything as close in size, square-wise, polygon-wise as we can. And then just moving it, basically just so long as I touch every vert, it's going to snap it right onto that object, so long as it's right underneath. So, we just go back into here, into our original shell, go to attach, and we click on that new one. And then using the border tool, just snap all these together. And then align, move a couple points around, make sure it's nice and smooth. It's looking pretty good so far. These areas weren't quite where I wanted them, so I'm just going to move them around a little bit. Whoops. Luckily, you can always undo if you have anything snap off into the grid or you just don't like the way it looks. Now we're just going to start building another piece of him here. And I'm going to make this a whole separate object because I'm going to use multiple shells to kind of mimic the look that Hong's design has really quick without having to actually go into concrete geometry right there. It's actually just going to be a modifier on top. We can have different size shells and whatnot, so it'll keep a pretty good look if how we want it. And by keeping the material IDs separated in the shell modifier, we're able to later on, when we attach all this together, delete all the inside stuff and just attach everything by welding points. So I'll speed some stuff up here. And also I want to keep this as a shoe, I have to remember, so it's not going to follow the foot exactly. But first I want to get the basic geometry in place, and then I'll start moving points around so it mimics a boot a little bit better. So at this point, I'm just going to keep moving these points around, but pretty soon we're going to have to build the actual outline of the shoe. So to do that, it's just like we did before, where we're going to draw along and kind of guess how many pieces of geometry we're going to need. Doesn't matter if we're off, we can always add more or remove some, but it's best to try and keep it about, keep in mind how much you want to add in this area. Because all the pieces that we're building, we're going to have to flow into this eventually. So, for the most part, you want to keep it as clean as you can, but also want to make sure that you have enough geometry to merge everything together without messing up the form later on. There we go. So we've got a complete little boot right there. Just going to move a few points around. At this point, take a quick look at it, see how it looks. Render it out. We've got the basic form of the boot kind of built in, but we still have a lot of work to do. I also like to have a bit of a lighter background when I'm rendering things out at the modeling stage. I think it makes them show up a little bit easier. So that's what it looks like. I hid the shell boot so it doesn't actually render anymore. So we can see the parts that we've actually built and how much we really have left to do. Which is quite a bit, but it'll go pretty quick. I'm just going to duplicate that entire edge loop at the bottom there and start making the seam where the sole and everything of the boot is going to be placed. Then he's got on his design, he has kind of a little bit of a toe piece. So I'm going to use the polystrips tool to build that really quick. You can see it has way too much geometry, but we can really quick just remove those pieces. Just have a hotkey set up to remove edge loops, and that's really all there is to it. So I'm going to adjust this piece of boot right here to look a little bit more boot-like. Right now it was kind of going along with as a toe might go, like a sock. But a boot has a lot more form to it, especially in that area. A little bit more protection. I'm just cleaning up some of these areas that have gotten a little bit stretched and strange looking. Now, not everything is going to be done in Polyboost. Some of this is just going to be done just by simply moving stuff with the normal max move tools. And then at this point I wanted the shape of the foot isn't exactly where I'd like it. So I'm going to use an FFD, freeform deformer, to move some points around really fast and also move the shell that we've been using to build everything on top of at the same time as our actual the actual boot geometry. So I want it to be a little bit thicker. Move that out a little bit more too. Because it should look like it's something that's actually encasing his foot, not just a tiny little shell that's been painted on there. And now that we've gotten everything in place, I'm just moving the FFD down below everything and then collapsing it, because we don't want to have to keep editing with that. Now that I've grabbed all the edges for what this piece is going to be, I ran a chamfer on it. And then I can clean up some of these parts that got triangulated. The goal is to keep it all in quads, basically. And I want this to have a bit of a flap that goes over the whole thing, so I'm just adding some more edges in there to keep it as sharp as we can go. There we go. We've got a good chunk of the boot built at this point. Let's take a look at these pants that we had on there. Kind of leveling up everything. We're not going to spend all of our time making sure that boot is just the most perfect boot in the world and then worry about making the pants the most perfect thing in the world. We're going to build everything in stages. So now that we've got a base boot built, say that 10 times fast, we're going to try and make the pants feel a little bit more like pants and not just like bulged out leg geometry. And this is all template geometry too, because what we're going to do later on is to actually take all this stuff into ZBrush and add all the wrinkles and seams and all that stuff, and then retopologize it so that it'll be animation friendly, but also hold all the detail that we want it to hold, without having to use displacements, which some pipelines just don't support, and ours is one of them. So I'm kind of going over his whole form and just looking at everything that we've built so far and seeing what I need to add and what I need to do. And there's quite a bit at this stage. We're very early. So I'm going to build a belt by grabbing the verts and faces around that edge. And then obviously that's not exactly the most clean looking belt. So I'll grab that center edge loop, and then running a chamfer on it, it'll make sure that everything's pretty flat on the top and bottom, and then I'll just delete that top and bottom edge loop, and then flatten it out as well. We could have just flattened out the top and bottom on the other one, but it wouldn't, I don't think, have held as close to the actual geometry of his pants and everything. You can see we also have a shell modifier on it, just like we put on other things, so that it'll pop out a little bit more. And I want to keep this a little bit sharper than the other stuff because it's a leather belt. And I like to do a lot of test renders when I'm working, just to see how everything's holding up. Okay, bring this crotch down a little bit. Pants don't ride quite that high in the crotch usually. Gonna move some of these points out, just trying to find the general look of how the pants are gonna hang off of his body. In Hong's design, it definitely bulges out quite a bit right there, so I want to make sure that I keep that. Now we're going to use the line tool, which is just under the splines option. And we're going to make the laces with that and a renderable spline. So I've turned on the snap option to make sure that it snaps to the faces, not just verts. I'm going to draw in a rough, quick look about how his laces on his boots are going to flow. I want to make sure that these are all in one object because I don't want to have a lot of little lace details to work with. There we go. So we got one side done. Obviously roughed in, but good enough for us right now. I'm going to build the other side. And then by turning on this option in here called Enabled in Renderer, we're going to make sure that this actually has a little bit of form when we render. And this is a great way to rough out any kind of tubes, laces, anything you need that's that kind of has this simple shape. You could do it with geometry as well, but what's nice here is that we only have a few defining curves that are really showing how this whole form is going to go together. Instead of having a lot of different edge loops and rings and all this stuff, we can just rough it in this way and only have to deal with maybe 3 or 4 different points. Now I want to do a symmetry on this, but because where I was building it, it didn't go to 0, 0, and it's rotated odd and everything's going to be a little bit strange. So I'm just going to affect the pivot only and snap it right into the center of the world right there. And there's some scripts out there for collapsing that you could use too, but you don't want to use that on this because it's going to turn it into geometry. Then I'm also adjusting the actual symmetry modifier to make sure that it's lined up right into the 0, 0 point of the world, so that the boots line up and everything works well. Now we can take a look at how this objects are looking. And then lastly here, I want to turn on the Enable Pass Control. And what this will do is that in case, since right now we're not doing anything that needs materials, it'll make sure that everything renders out with the exact same material. So you just turn that on and then use a custom material and just drag it right onto there instanced, and it'll make sure everything that we render, except for hair or any kind of, I think, atmospheric type stuff that would affect your geometry, is going to come out and look just the same. All the same material is going to be attached to it. So now we're just filling in behind the foot there. We'll hide this geometry so we can really quick just put everything where we need it. Connecting those verts, and then adding an edge loop right there. And I want to unhide everything again so we can see it. And what I like to do sometimes to fill in these things is just I'll grab 2 edges, turn them into vertex, and then fill the 2. There's a number of different plugins that actually use that fill, or you could just use Connect or whatever you want to do. But for me, that's the quickest way. You could also probably use the bridge tool, but sometimes I think that leaves an open edge. So I'm trying to avoid using that unless it's on faces. And we need a little bit more geometry in here. Ankle's a area that's going to deform a lot. So you want to make sure that this can move around and look okay. And he's also drew in some nice wrinkles in there, so I want to kind of start roughing out how those are going to look. I'm about ready to put everything together as one object, so I want to make sure that this is all going to flow into itself pretty well. Don't want any big open holes or anything. Because right now it's a little too obvious that it's 2 separate pieces. Got a lot of the boot roughed in right now. It's almost finished. So it has a little bit of cleanup and detailing and whatnot. But the overall form is pretty much there. Still have to do some stuff to make sure that the bottom looks a little bit more boot-like. The toes should be a little upturned. There should be a little piece in the arch of the foot that kind of goes up a little bit, which we're putting in the geometry right now so that we're able to do that. And our loop structure is pretty clean too, so that's good. But we'll clean up a few more areas to make sure it flows nicely. Then I'm just connecting, and I turn on the snap to vertex to make sure that I don't have any floating connects or anything. Sometimes it'll, as I think I mentioned in the first chapter, it'll, when you use the connect tool, if snap's not on, it'll leave, you'll think that you hit the edge, but you really are just a little bit off, and it can be very annoying later on when you find out you've got a edge that, or a vert that's been added to an area that's just kind of floating in the middle there. Quick way to check that is just turn turbo smooth on and make sure it looks nice and smooth. Right here we got a couple holes we want to fill in, so we're just going to cap that, and then collapse a couple of these areas because it's just a little bit too much geometry and too messy. So before you can collapse, you have to make sure that the two verts are actually connected by an edge. There we go. A little more geometry in there to keep that nice looking rubber seam. All this is still very roughed in, but we're starting to get a pretty good feel for how this boot's going to look. Some of this got a little weird, so just adjust these things. Some areas you might find you've done a little too much detail, so you can just grab an edge ring and use the collapse, and that'll pretty much kill at least one edge loop. But want to make sure that doesn't fall into any areas that are not completely circular in the loop, because you can get some very strange results that way. There's his, the shell of the boot. I just kind of hid that. We don't need to see that anymore. We've pretty much got the entire boot roughed in now. We don't need that shell to build on top of anymore. But the overall form isn't quite there yet, so want to make sure it flows in the pants a little nicer. But you want to also make sure that that calf doesn't collapse into itself. Once again, this is a boot, so it needs to make sure that everything is feeling like it's on top of an actual foot. I just want to bring all this below all of our modifiers so we can collapse it. I'm noticing the pants look a little funky right now, so we're going to do some edits here. Flow of the pants is getting a little bunched in the crotch, so I want to keep that a little bit cleaner. So still disconnecting all these points and cleaning areas, and then using that loop tools again to both set flow and center any of these edge rings. Excuse me, edge loops. I'll speed things up a little bit now. Still removing some loops that we just don't need anymore. The overall form is pretty much there. So we can take a look at the concept again, see what's missing. Obviously those pouches are going to be on top of there, so I kind of don't want to worry too much about this. So I'm going to rough those in really quick just by using a box. Scaling it a little bit, making sure that it's about the right size.